would you ever like to write for like Marvel or DC again, or like Boom Studios or any other company?
Yeah.
And which character would you like to write about?
Well, my white whale, I don't know who owns the rights to it, which is part of the reason why it's still my white whale. Captain Planet. Uh,
Oh, okay.
that's a franchise that like is in dire need of a 21st century reboot. Honestly, you give Captain Planet pants and like 90% of the work's done.
Yeah.
I've got a pitch for that I think really kind of represents kind of the best of the property and really kind of repositions it in today's world, where I think sort of the environmental and capitalistic concerns are more important than ever. I think that was a show that was really ahead of its time. As far as other characters over at the Big Two, like I said, I got my start with the Big Two, both as a reader and working in the industry.
Mhm.
So I always have a soft spot for those characters. Shazam, it would be a bucket list character. I know you wouldn't think that based on sort of the grittier stuff I write, but I think Billy Batson is like an all-time great character, and I could write 100 issues of him with no problem. He's a good kid. He's got that hope, and I think he really is kind of the best and the brightest of the DC universe, and I feel like that hasn't been explored. That's not an angle that's been explored in some time. Doctor Strange over at
Okay.
Marvel for sure. I would love to write Doctor Strange. Exiles actually is kind of, I would love to write Exiles, and every so often whenever I talk with somebody at Marvel, I always kind of throw that out there, just because I feel like that would be like that would fit my wheelhouse really well, I think, of me being able to kind of remix some of these characters a little bit and sort of bring together some unorthodox pairings, and just kind of play around with the continuity of the Marvel universe. Uh, or just, I mean, heck, if I could write the Justice League or the Avengers, I've been thinking about those characters since I was a teenager.
Sure.
That's sort of a bucket list, maybe someday. But
I'm sorry. What current books are you reading right now?
oh man, well, the X-Men line's got me through the pandemic. I actually just tweeted at the whole X-Men crew today because I just read X-Men 19 and it was just so good. Al Ewing, his books are just also just incredible. He's kind of the writer I'd like to be when I grow up. Immortal Hulk is fantastic. Guardians of the Galaxy, I think more people should be reading. I think not enough people are talking about it. What else am I reading? The Autumnal over at Vault by
Okay.
my buddy Chris Sheehan. Chris and I worked on a short during the pandemic, and he's just a phenomenal artist and a really nice guy to boot. White Ash by my buddy Charlie Stickney. What else am I? Department of Truth.
Not to mention that.
James Tynion in general
Yeah.
has really just like leveled up in a big way over the last 6 months. Or whenever Department of Truth #1 came out. Maybe it was a little longer than that. I've been reading his Batman and Joker, which was a book that I was kind of skeptical about. Now I've read, it's 2 issues out now, or 3 issues. It's really good. So those are the ones that are sort of coming to mind immediately. Oh, Donny Cates's Venom.
Okay, yeah, that's about to end too.
Yeah, I consider Donnie to be a little aspirational as far as the speed at which he writes, and the consistency at which he writes. And I consider, whenever anybody asks me about the Big Two, I always talk about Donny Cates. And it's because the Big Two, and I don't think I'm talking out of school when I say this, there's sometimes a tendency to say, okay, this person had a book at XYZ hot publisher. They're getting XYZ amount of buzz. Let's kind of snap them up because they're the hot new talent. And the problem is that that's a lot of pressure to put on somebody who's only put out a book or two. And, the Big Two, it's a very different animal than writing, even at a place like Aftershock, where Aftershock, I just have to deliver one script a month. Marvel and DC are doing double that. You have to sort of weave through all the corporate concerns. You don't really have much say, if anything, as far as who your artists are. You're kind of at the mercies of whatever the editors have to do and their obligations. When you sort of put it all together like that, it takes a real professional to thread the needle and get through that meat grinder. A lot of people burn out. A lot of people put out work that I think they would even agree is not their best work, because how can you, if you don't have the conditioning for it? And I see somebody like Donny Cates, he worked his way up the trenches. Venom wasn't his first book. It wasn't even close to his first book. God Country wasn't even his first book. He had been slowly kind of putting in his reps and chiseling away, working on books like Ghost Fleet and A Tomahawk. And I know Baby Teeth came out concurrently with God Country, but even those, Buzzkill, and their Interceptor. There are more that I'm forgetting, but as a result, when he was tapped for the big leagues, he already had been conditioned, and he was able to kind of navigate a very challenging work environment and be able to say, okay, I know how to write a script very, very fast, but to do it at a level of quality and have that level of planning and craftsmanship that he expects out of himself. And that's what I want. I don't want to be the guy who thinks he can run before he can walk.
Sure.
And so that's part of the reason why, when people say, well, are you doing anything in Marvel or DC right now? And I said, well, no, but like when it's meant to happen, it'll happen. Right now I would much rather just keep putting my reps in, and make sure that I've earned it. Sebastian Perez is an artist who I believe his bio is work until you don't have to introduce yourself anymore.
Okay.
And I think that's a really good mentality. And it's something that really inspires me to keep focusing on my creator-owned work. And, if the big two come calling, I think that's something that would certainly be a pleasure to do and be helpful just as far as my long-term aspirations. But I'm not in any rush. Just like Spencer and Locke 3, this is something I want to get done right, not done fast. And so, if they want me, they know where to find me. And until then, I'll just keep putting out work.
Sure. When you said they may reach out to you, would you reach out to them, or how does that work?
I've had conversations with
Okay.
people that we do. They know who I am. It's one of those things that's just, and this is the case in comics in general, is, editors are busy people, and there's always lots of fires that need to be put out. And there's lots of obligations to be made with existing talent before you even start thinking about new and up and coming talent. And so, it's one of those things that you just kind of keep checking in every time you get new work. And you say, okay, here's something I've got going on right now. And, beyond that, it's just, you wait for the stars to align, and you don't get yourself too worked up. I mean, I see myself as an independent comics creator, first and foremost. And, if something comes to change that, great. That's sort of a conversation that I can have down the road and kind of figure out what does that mean, for my long-term ambitions. But thinking of myself just as an indie creator, it really kind of helps keep things in perspective that, that's dessert. But for now, I'm just enjoying the meat and potatoes of creator owned.
Where do you see yourself, say, 5 years from now?
Probably doing what I'm doing now, maybe
Yeah.
hopefully more of it,
Yeah.
but I've tried all the stable jobs, I don't think I was a good fit, to be honest. Comics is the first job that I feel like I can do well. My father's an eye surgeon.
Wow.
And that's a job that he like eats and breathes and sleeps. It's the right combination of research and surgery and emerging tech. That it just really clicks for him. And he's kind of the reason I wound up taking the plunge in the first place. Is I remember I was working at CBS, and I had visited my father, and he says, he's like, well, how's work? And I was like, well, it's work, he's like, well, what do you plan on doing in 5 years? Exactly what you're asking me. And I was like, I don't know, like, because it's CBS, like, just like it's an older viewership, it's also an older executive class. And so, people don't really retire there as much as they get carried out on stretchers. And he said, well, what's the thing that only you can do? And it really kind of clicked for me. I mean, obviously I'm not the only person who can write, like there's a whole industry of person, but I'm the only person who can write the way that I write. I'm the only person who can come up with ideas the way that I come up with ideas. And so that was really kind of the big moment of permission, where I said, oh, maybe I'll give this a shot just to kind of see how it goes, where it takes me. Um, and so I'm lucky that I have that job, that I can eat and breathe and sleep and dream. I think a lot of people aren't that lucky, you know? And so I try not to take it for granted. I mean, trust me, there are plenty of days where the comics industry makes me want to put my head through a wall. There's all sorts of nonsense and drama and challenges and setbacks and failures and all sorts of things that, you know, make you question why you do this in the first place. But, you know, I get a page of art and I forget all about it. You know,
don't tell us fans that. Don't tell us fans that. We just think everything's great. You know. So.
Well, no, I get a piece of art and I'm just like, this is amazing. You know, this is the best job in the world. You know, I love getting comics art even more than anybody. Sure. And it really is. It's the astronaut job. This is the best job in the world.
Nice.
You know, and that's the thing that I keep reminding myself is that, like, you know, every job's going to have its frustrations because that's what a job is. But this is an awesome job. You know, I get to work from home and I get to play pretend and get paid for it. That's great. And so I try not to take that for granted. And I really just reinforce myself, like, you got to love this business to be in it. And I'm fortunate that I really do love it. And it just, that's the sort of thing that inspires me to get up every day, you know, always working on something, and just inspires me to just keep trying to bring my A game, because the day that I don't bring my A game is the day that I don't deserve to be here anymore.
I'm gonna talk now about the books, if that's okay with you. Okay, so in Spencer and Locke, volume 2, there was this one page where this character's name was Norbert. Mm-hmm. And I said, is that Dilbert from the comic strips? Right? Yeah, I can tell by the glasses. I go, wait a minute, I've seen this character somewhere before.
Yeah, well, that had been on the to-do list for a very long time, because Scott Adams is a dick. Like, it's really the only way I can describe it, you know. The creator of Dilbert is a dick. And so I was like, well, if volume 2 of Spencer and Locke is going to be me kind of opening up across the funny pages, you know, going full fables with it, I was like, well, I have to do something for Dilbert. And I was like, well, this guy sucks. So, like, I was like, I'm going to give this guy a swirly. And so that's what I did. That was like one of the very first creative choices I made for volume 2. I knew, I was like writing out my bullet points and I was like, issue 2, give Dilbert a swirly. So yes, I'm glad you caught it. We had all sorts of, we had High and Lois thrown in there. We had Hagar the Horrible, we had a brief cameo. We even had a little Family Circus nod in there.
Oh, wow. I missed all those. I'm going to have to reread it.
Brenda Starr. We had our riff on Brenda Starr in the book. But yeah, you know, I grew up in St. Louis, home of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. They had a really nice comic section when I was growing up. So I really got to dig back into my childhood and figure out, like, what are the strips that I grew up with, and really figure out ways that I could throw them together. That's how I knew who Beetle Bailey was. Was the inspiration for Roach Riley, the villain of our second volume. And you know, it's a love letter to the newspaper strips of my childhood.
I thought Roach Riley, I go, didn't he die? And he gets like run over and he just kind of almost like a Terminator mentality. I mean, what's going on with this guy? You know? Yeah.
Well, you know, he's kind of he's sort of the evil opposite for Spencer and Locke. You know, Locke is a character, not to spoil too much about the series, but, you know, he's a guy who grew up in a profoundly traumatizing and abusive upbringing.
Yes.
And so as a result, he's kind of had to invent his own best friend, Spencer, his imaginary 7-foot tall Blue Panther, kind of as his release valve. You know, he's so just profoundly alone that's his mind's way of kind of helping him dig himself out. Roach is sort of like, he went the opposite direction. You know, he's sort of, he had the accelerated course in pain and suffering. You know, he was a POW overseas. He's the sole survivor of his platoon. And he's come back thinking, like, well, no, like, this is a good thing, because if you've had the worst day of your life, then nothing else can hurt you in comparison. And so he's come back saying, like, you know, I feed on pain, and me giving you pain is a gift. If I can break you, I can turn you into something stronger and more resilient. And so, you know, that's the thing I really like most about Spencer and Locke too, is it wasn't just like a physical brawl, like it felt like a meeting of the minds a little bit. But yeah, Roach, we had a lot of inspirations behind that. Stuff like Heath Ledger's Joker, the Terminator, like you said, Taxi Driver, the Deer Hunter. We kind of all threw those together. Just somebody who was bigger and stronger and faster and meaner than Locke. And so really the only sort of equalizer that Locke has is he's not fighting alone.
Sure.
And so that really kind of became the fulcrum of that story of just figuring out, how is Spencer and Locke's friendship going to withstand, this sort of irresistible force in the form of Roach, and what's it going to cost them to win? Without spoiling anything, the costs are pretty dire.
Yeah. I mean, he lost a lot at the end. Speaking of the end of Spencer and Locke, Volume 2, the last page, for myself, it reminded me when Spider-Man quit being Spider-Man and he left his his outfit in a garbage can.
Yeah, that was intentional.
Okay.
For sure. When I for me, it's funny working with George Santiago Jr. His background is manga. That was sort of, and you can see it in his style, but things like Ranma 1/2 and One Piece, those were kind of the big influences for him. Whereas for me, it was big too, Marvel and DC, Western comics. And so a lot of the conversations he and I have are figuring out like, okay, how can we take my influences and take your influences, and like, how can we kind of match those together in a way that feels greater than the sum of their parts? And so a lot of times I will be sending George just, reference art from other books, just being like, hey, could we tweak this guy's pose to look something like this? Or, hey, this is kind of the thing that I'm looking to homage here. This is a particular scene. And, we talk a lot about this book in particular in the thumbnail stages, just to figure out ways that, like, how do we present the things we're trying to present in a way that are not titillating or, played for laughs, because that's the thing I don't want about Spencer and Locke in particular, is I don't want to punch down on people who have PTSD or people who have grown up in abusive environments or people who have struggled with suicidal thoughts. That's not anything that I kind of want to punch down on. I want people to feel like, no, you're not alone. That's the thing about Spencer and Locke, is at the end of the day, you're never alone. And so George and I, we talk a lot. I can say, for example, without spoiling anything, the first page of issue 2 of the first volume, we probably redrew that thing 3 times, really to make sure that we kind of hit that sweet spot of like, how do we present this in a way that isn't going to be like hugely triggering for people, but still gets the point across. And that's sort of an ongoing conversation and an ongoing tightrope we have to walk. But it's something that we're consistently talking about with every single issue.
Well, like I said, once you get going with Volume 3, you have my email. I'm just saying that again. So just in case you forgot, let's get on to the OZ, Warzone. I asked you about, permission from the family or whomever owns it, and you gave me that answer. But the character, Dorothy Gale, and I was like, wow, is it the actual granddaughter? Because I thought for a second, I thought she was adopted or something.
That's her granddaughter.
That's her granddaughter.
It's one of those things. It's funny because it's one of those things that I wanted to make it a point of making Dorothy, our new Dorothy, a woman of color in this book. I think that's something, the conversation about representation is something that I'm always talking about with my books. And it's actually something I owe George Santiago Jr. a lot for this, because we talked about that at the beginning of Spencer and Locke. And the question that George had, as an artist of color himself, was, is there a reason we don't make Spencer and Locke a character of color?
Okay.
And the reason we decided against it was specifically, I said, look, I can look in the mirror. I know that I'm a straight white male. I'm Jewish, but that doesn't really count for much in Hollywood. Knowing what this series is about, having sort of, him in an abusive urban environment, if I made Locke a character of color it would veer into some pretty nasty stereotypes, and it would suddenly be like, oh, well, you're telling this is the story of a Calvin and Hobbes of color, and this is what you've turned them into. It would be totally kind of counter to what the story was supposed to be about. So we opted not to do that in this book. But it made me think that that's a conversation I need to have with every single book is there a reason not to have a lead character be a person of color or be a woman or be a member of the LGBTQ community? Is there a reason not to do that? Would it lean into any sort of stereotyping if I did that? And if the answer is no, then it's something that I try to lean into whenever possible. My follow-up book, Going to the Chapel, female led with two men of color as sort of the romantic leads. That was something that Gavin Guidry and I were very specific about, when we were talking about it. And same thing for Dorothy in the OZ. I knew that this was going to be a book that we're not going to have a whole lot of human characters in it, but if we're going to have one, I think having her be a woman of color, what's the harm?
Sure.
Sort of my thinking on that. And it also does work in terms of a utilitarian bent because, right, everybody associates the original Dorothy as sort of white bread Kansas. And so being able to say this is a very easy way to be this is a different Dorothy. And one who kind of has to, who is living in the shadow of her grandmother and realizing that all this crazy stuff that my grandma said that I thought it was just dementia. No, it's real. It was all real. And yet at the same time, there's so many things that Grandma Dorothy did not know. And so kind of having to reconcile a lot of things, and as well as our new Dorothy's, her past as a soldier in Iraq and Afghanistan. It just felt like there was a lot of dramatic potential to be mined there. And something that, as far as representation goes, it certainly helped me sleep better at night.
Yeah, post-traumatic PTSD. When I read it, you're writing on that. I'm not a soldier, but I read her. I felt her anguish.
Yeah.
And I read it, that part, more than once. It was like, oh my God, this is. I felt bad for her.
Sure.
It was awful. I was like, dang it, man.
She's a lot of my characters start off at rock bottom.
Yeah.
For that reason is because there's really nowhere to go but up after that. And yeah, Dorothy, there was, a lot of the stories a lot of the interviews that I did with soldiers coming back, when I was in the Berkshires, really informed Dorothy's character. This is a story. The OZ's been in the works since the first volume of Spencer and Locke came out. That was one of the 3 ideas that I came up with after Spencer and Locke came out. And I was like, oh, people like this. Okay, I still have a career. I wasn't sure, if people hated that book, I was not going to write another one. It was, it would not be worth the time and the effort. But thankfully people liked it. And so Dorothy, thinking about, the fact that sort of the sense of isolation and the alienation, coming back, because it's hard to convey to people, and you sort of got this very hard structure of being in the service, and then you come back and, we don't live that structured of a life, as a culture, so says the freelancer. And so, it can be really alienating and sort of, it's almost a feeling of whiplash in a way. You're sort of, it's sort of, certain times it's you have a certain type of action when you're overseas, and then it's a certain type of quiet when you come home. And conversely, you've got all this kind of noise of our culture that's very different and very piercing and very, disorienting of our culture that you kind of don't, you get desensitized from when you're overseas. So it's definitely, it also helps that there's no one size fits all, reaction to PTSD or coming back from war, and figuring out your purpose. And that, is helpful as well. And that's something that I think I talk about a lot with covering trauma in my work in general is, a lot of it is filtered through sort of my own feelings of trauma on certain things and my own experience with that. But knowing full well that my experience isn't always going to match somebody else's, and just trying to be kind of as open and inclusive about it as I can, to be as respectful about it as I can. It's really the word. I feel like as long as I'm doing my best and have it rooted in some form of, of reality, I feel like people are usually pretty forgiving because they know that, like, if you're respectful about it, that does go a really long way.
There was this one character that tugged at my heart when I see, I'm not going to say who the character is, but
I think I know what you're talking about.
And then they spoke, and then they asked about Dorothy. I was like, oh my gosh. I was wondering, what I was reading, I was going, I hope this character shows up. I hope this character shows up. And then towards the end, the character did. So that was awesome, by the way.
Yeah. Without spoiling too much, and anybody who's read the book will know what we're talking about, just reading the lines. But that character, I actually rewrote their arc pretty dramatically, without spoiling too much. That character not only was inspired by a character, from the original source material, but was also inspired, I had a character like that in my life. And when I was writing this series, she was diagnosed with cancer. And so I spent, I think 8 or 9 months before the pandemic, taking her to radiation, eventually kind of doing end of life care. And so it was one of those things that I was like, okay, like I originally was not going to have a big role for that character in the book. And I was just kind of like, well, I can't do away with this character in my fiction. Like the real world already is kind of sucky enough in that regard. So I really rewrote that whole character's arc, really kind of giving them some more stuff to do throughout the whole series. And thank goodness, Ruben Rojas, the artist in the book, really draws this character very well. So I'm very excited to see more pages. The stuff that Ruben has turned in is fantastic for our second installment. But yes, very excited to see more and more of this character as the series progresses.
Yeah, I stopped reading and I just stared for a couple of seconds. I go, this is awesome. I go, I like this. I think I know volume 2 or number 2. Issue 2 hasn't come out yet, but I think, I don't want to be a spoiler, but I think another animal is alive.
Yeah.
Right.
This is a story about legacy in a lot of ways. And so, without spoiling too much, we only get to see the Cowardly Lion a little bit in our first issue. But our take on the Cowardly Lion, I think, is really fun. He was a character that took a little bit to get his voice, but I'm very excited with what we got planned for him. In a lot of ways, he shares a certain kinship with Dorothy. Dorothy is a former soldier who's kind of thrust into this uncomfortable role of leadership. And this is a guy who, courage is a very different calculus when you're just fighting for yourself versus when you have to lead. The lion is the king of the animal kingdom. And so his calculus of what bravery is has changed significantly. And so he kind of finds himself a little bit adrift, kind of figuring out like, well, what does it mean to be brave when your decisions affect more than just you? And so he does have a certain kinship with Dorothy in that regard. I when I was talking with Ruben, I said, in a lot of ways, it's like Black Panther and Steve Rogers in a way. That sort of, they're warriors of two very different stripes, but they have that same respect for one another, just knowing that like the weight of responsibility, it weighs very heavily on both of their shoulders. So he's a really fun character to write. I'm excited for people to get to see more of him in our next issue. In fact, I just got a cover today for our next issue that really spectacular. And so I can't wait for people to get to see it. It's gonna be a little bit, but I am confident that the series has been written for a while, so it's just Ruben getting back on schedule post sort of COVID complications.
Uh-huh.
But now that he's back sort of at the drawing table, I'm convinced this is definitely going to be worth the wait.
And it's going to be on Kickstarter also, correct?
I've said this, and I will repeat it to anyone who asks, because some people are like, oh, is this going to get published in a publisher, or is there going to be another chance to do this? We have no plans for a publisher release at this moment.
Okay.
If that changes, I'll shout it from the rooftop. But as of yet, we are not affiliated with a publisher. I am committed to doing this whole thing through Kickstarter.
Okay.
Because look, it's the Kickstarter community that rolled the dice on us when a lot of publishers who did express interest in the OZ couldn't quite get the ball across the 1 yard line as far as giving us a contract. And so the Kickstarter backers took a chance on us. And so I'm not going to pull the football away from them. And so, yes, readers will have their chance to get it on Kickstarter first. And, if we wind up signing a deal with a publisher down the line, that's a cherry on top. But I'm committed to our Kickstarter backers. And so I'll have to get hit by a bus for this thing not to get finished on Kickstarter first.
Well, myself, and I'm sure all the readers out there, thank you very much for that. Let's get to your last book, Scout's Honor. And that's the very first book that I read of yours, by the way. I stopped almost immediately because I had to look up when you said 562 days. I had to stop. How many years is that? It was 26.19 years basically. But then I liked when you said 260 years later. I went, oh, that's pretty cool. Wow, that grabbed me from the beginning. So
that choice. So for those who haven't read Scout's Honor, just the quick pitch for it is years after a nuclear war, a cult has risen from the ashes, and their Bible is an old Boy Scout manual. And so our story follows Kit, and like you said, jumps a couple hundred years after the war, and Kit is kind of the best and brightest of the Ranger Scouts of America. An initiate who is harboring kind of a dark secret in this sense. The Ranger Scouts are kind of this patriarchal, hyper-masculine cult that only allows men to serve. And so Kit has to conceal her identity as a woman in order to pursue her calling as a Ranger Scout. And her what happens to her when she finds out that her religion might have been built on a lie.
Yeah.
And so it's funny because the way that story kind of came together, I've been watching a show called The Path on Hulu. Aaron Paul's in it. It's really good if you haven't seen it. But it's basically about a Scientology style cult and what happens to a guy when he gets disillusioned and tries to leave. So what happens to him and what happens to his family and what happens to the guy who's running the cult. So while I was watching that, I was like, that's really interesting. Like, what's the weirdest thing that somebody could use as a Bible for a religion? Mm-hmm. And when I thought of a Boy Scout manual, a lot of things started clicking. But the thing about cults is that there's a degree of isolation. There has to be, in order for any sort of kind of ritual belief system to form, you have to sort of cultivate that in isolation. Because otherwise you're going to have, random people coming in and being like, well, that's weird. Don't you think you're looking at this Boy Scout manual like a little too hard? You have to isolate them. And so there's two ways to do it. You could either isolate them geographically, kind of do a Lord of the Flies sort of thing, which there's a little bit of Lord of the Flies in the DNA of that book for sure. But you could also do it temporally. And I thought, oh, okay, we plunged the world into sort of a new dark ages. And sort of, history is a game of telephone. What happens if you cut that off? What sort of scraps of the old world would human beings kind of cling to for that continuity? Mm-hmm. What would we build that new foundation of knowledge on? And so I was thinking like, oh yeah, like let's just change the whole palette. We'll make it Boy Scout themed. That was like, okay, that tracks. And that gives me, doing it temporally versus geographically, it also kind of gave me a lot of latitude to say, all right, like the world's been built. And so we as the reader, we're sort of dropped into it and we get to kind of explore it as it's been fully built rather than having to watch a cult sort of start from the beginning and grow out from there.
The first issue, the character Kit at the very end, when they revealed, that she's a female, that I was like, wow, that's another one of my stop moments. I go, what? that totally caught me by surprise. And now,
I'm glad.
thumbs up on that. I was like, wow,
The reason we did that, well, first off, Luca Casalanguida, my artist on Scouts Honor, he was really terrific on nailing kind of that androgynous feel for Kit. And that was something we talked about at the jump, sort of like almost like a Kristen Stewart kind of vibe. But what's funny is that wrinkle in the script, which wound up becoming like, I think, a really important part of the book, kind of came at the 11th hour. Like I said, Aftershock, the pitch process for them was very different. First and foremost, because they knew me already. Mike Martz knew me. Steve Rotterdam, their SVP of marketing, knew me also from DC. Lee Kramer, the president of the company, I've bothered him for quite some time. Took him out to lunch, been like, okay, let me tell you about some ideas. So I had sent them a bunch of log lines for this book, a bunch of log lines for a bunch of series, just saying like, do you like any of this? Does any of this feel like a good fit for Aftershock? And of course, they picked the idea that I had like barely developed, that really I had just come up with like 2 weeks prior. And so they're like, okay, post-apocalyptic Boy Scout cult. That sounds cool. Work on that. And my first thought was, oh, crap. Like, how is this going to fly in 2019 about an all-male cult? Like, that's not going to fly. That's weird. And then I realized, like, no, lean into that. That is weird. Like that is super weird. Let's show what that kind of world would be like for a woman to have to navigate. And with some mild spoilers, Des, sort of Kit's best frenemy, or best friend turned rival, he's a member of the LGBTQ community. And I thought that really reinforces the themes that we're playing with here, which is, you strip away the apocalyptic elements and you strip away the Boy Scout imagery. And, it's the story of a small, conservative, isolated town. Sure. And, for a certain type of person, you fit a certain mold, the world's your oyster. But what happens if you don't? Like, how do you navigate your life if you don't fit that ideal? Especially if people don't know you don't fit that ideal. There's sort of that element of almost self-loathing. The feel that you got to always have your guard up, that you can't live an authentic life.
Yeah.
You can't even face an authentic life. And I think that's a struggle that a lot of people can empathize with. I mean, I like I said, I grew up in a particularly conservative pocket of St. Louis, Missouri, which is now a very deep red state. And I think that upbringing really informed the way that I put this series together, because you're raised a certain way, and then you leave home for the first time, and suddenly you're kind of bombarded with conflicting views, and you realize that a lot of the things that you were raised to think of as bedrock, as set in stone, suddenly aren't as firm as you thought, and you have to really kind of recalibrate based on new knowledge. And that can be so disorienting. But I think that is the coming of age. That's the crucial part of coming of age. And so that was something that I think really gave Scouts Honor a lot of its heart.
How many issues is it going to be? Is it 5?
5. Yes.
Okay.
So the final issue is up for pre-orders now. Code, I believe, is MAR for March 211013. I believe is the pre-order code for that. And then we'll have a trade collection out, I believe, in September. I think is when that's due out. But yeah, it's one of those things. Having been working on Spencer and Locke 3 for quite some time, sequels are hard. So it's one of those things. I never want to overstay my welcome on a book. I'd much rather have like a distinct beginning, middle, and end. Also, because I get restless. Like, I don't like doing sequels unless I know I've got like a firm story planned for it. I always have ideas in my back pocket, so I never say never. If readers really want it, if Aftershock really wants it, if Luca's game for more, I'm happy to circle back, to the world of Scouts Honor. But at the same time, I wanted to make sure that like people got a satisfying story with Kit. And so if this is the end of that story, I certainly won't have any trouble sleeping at night.
I want to apologize. I'm not sure if you heard my phone ring. I thought I turned it off, but it's been ringing.
Oh, no.
I apologize if you heard that.
Yeah.
My last thoughts about Scout's Honor, this is just me, but when I was reading it, for some reason, I had a vibe of Planet of the Apes. And by that, I mean the way they led their lives and their bylaws, so to speak. And then when Charlton Heston came, everything just, flew out the window, so to speak. I just got that vibe.
I appreciate that. It's one of those things. I love Planet of the Apes. I watched that. First time I saw it, I was in high school. And I really enjoyed it. It was kind of, it was my first like sci-fi kind of B movie. There's definitely, I can definitely see echoes of it in there. It's funny. It wasn't intentional when I wrote it, but seeing it, I'm like, oh yeah, totally. There's absolutely anybody who likes the original Planet of the Apes, there's something for them there. I also, there are things like Mad Max Fury Road, the Fallout series. I love the Fallout game series to the point where I'm not allowed to play them anymore because I wouldn't get any work done. The Hunger Games, The Handmaid's Tale, just to name a few. But yeah, it's definitely, it's funny. You're not the first one to say, if you like Planet of the Apes, you like Scout's Honor. And honestly, that's a wonderful film to be compared to. So
wow, I'm glad I brought it up. I was debating whether or not to ask you that. I go,
yeah.
Think that I'm crazy.
No, you're not the first.
Thank you.
You're not the first, and I appreciate it.
Yeah. So I think we're at the end. I think I've asked all the questions. This is going on for a long time. I think we're going to have to edit this into segments. I just want to thank you again, David, for being on our channel. I think you're our very first interview for the Department of Comics.
I'm glad to start the bar low for you.
Yeah, no, it was high. Trust me, it was very high.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time, and anybody who wants to find out more about what I'm up to, you can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I'm at Pepose D on Twitter and Instagram, or David Pepose Comics on Facebook. You can also subscribe to my newsletter, Pep Talks, at bit.ly/pepnews, or visit my website, davidpepose.com.
I'm on Instagram a lot, and I'm going to mention you just to let you know.
Thank you.
And once again, this is Efren from the Department of Comics. Thank you once again, David, for doing this interview.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. Everybody take care.